Kent, Garden of England, land of hops and apple orchards, country pubs, medieval towns, great cathedrals and many, many castles. Big, small, ruined and renovated. Surprising for such a small county until you realise that it's separated from the continent by the 21-mile wide English Channel. As a result, Kent has been threatened with invasion since Roman times. Originally built as forts, many castles have now evolved into heritage properties. They're set high in beautiful grounds or at the heart of fascinating towns and villages, and usually close to the sea or by a river crossing. It was the Romans who were well known for choosing such strategically important locations. Dover is a valley of the River Dour, and in Roman times it was a very wide estuary. There was a Roman fort established with a vicus, a civilian settlement, around it. Dover Castle fended off many attacks and threats of invasion. Today it still commands the famous chalky white cliffs. Rochester Castle began as a Roman fort to protect a bridge over the River Medway on the strategic route between Dover and London. It grew in importance when St Augustine made it a bishopric. Other castles at Richborough and Stutful did not fare so well. In time the rivers silted up, some forts were left high and dry, and these great Roman ports declined in importance. Reculver suffered a reverse fate due to coastal erosion. Over the years, excavations have helped to shed light on the history of castle building, which had begun in earnest with the Norman invasion of 1066.
They were invasion force. They didn't bring building materials with them. They first had to establish themselves in the country, establish their rule, and they started building first of all out of wood. And eventually then they started to supplant their wooden Motte and Bailey castles with proper stone, strong structures. What was unique about it was strength and the engineering that was involved in it. You know, these simply weren't stone structures that were thrown up. They were designed with fields of fire, observation, defense mechanisms.
Another classic example of Motte and Bailey architecture is Tunbridge Castle.
You would have had various floors for banqueting. Below us, underneath, you would have perhaps a dungeon or maybe a barracks for the soldiers. The horses would have been kept in the castle itself, and outside the castle would have been a town. So really, if in times of strife, the townspeople would come into the castle. If the castle walls were breached, then the garrison and the lord would have retreated into the keep. But basically, it would have been used very much as living quarters.
Ightham Moat is one of the finest examples of a medieval moated manor house. The moat was built in the 14th century to keep out wandering bands of robbers. The River Lens feeds the moat that surrounds the fairy tale castle of Leeds. The grounds of the castle saw many jousting tournaments during the reign of Henry VIII, the same king who spent a fair amount of time at Hever Castle.
The castle was built in the 13th century by a gentleman called William de Hever, and that's how Hever itself got its name. It was Anne Boleyn's great-grandfather who built the house inside the castle walls and made it his home, and so she would have strolled around there, and Henry would have come to visit her later on.
Deal and Walmer castles were built by Henry VIII in anticipation of a French and Spanish attack after he'd alienated himself from the Catholic Church in order to marry Anne Boleyn.
Gunpowder was getting, and cannons were getting quite well developed, and therefore you had to develop a structure that could not only fire cannons, but would also take the impact of the gunpowder of the time.
The threatened invasion never came, and these were the last of the traditional castles to be built in Kent. Fortunately, many castles were so well built that they even survived attempts to level them. In the early 1700s, the city decided to get rid of Rochester Castle.
They brought in a gunpowder expert, and he laid tons and tons of explosive against the wall, blew it up, and a couple of stones sort of just bobbed down. Nothing really happened. And they decided that it was then too expensive to blow it up, and they'd leave it to fall down.
For more information, visit our website on topoftheworld.net.